Globalization and Corporate Crime, Module 7, Part 1 readings. Let's start with your readings on the Panama Papers. What were they? They were, in some ways, an unprecedented leak of documents on more than 214,000 offshore entities, connected to people in more than 200 countries and territories. They were records, actually, from a little-known but very powerful law firm based in Panama, Mossack Fonseca, with branches in Hong Kong, Miami, Zurich, and 35 other cities. It included the offshore holdings of 12 current and former world leaders and revealed how associates of Russian President Vladimir Putin secretly shuffled as much as $2 billion through banks and shadow companies. More than 500 banks, their subsidiaries and branches, had worked with Mossack Fonseca since the 1970s to help clients manage offshore companies. Thousands of accounts were created by international giants UBS and HSBC, Swiss-based banks. And what was detailed in the documents was corruption of international scope, including from the International Soccer Federation, FIFA, from its ethics committee, involving officials paying bribes to win broadcast rights to Latin America soccer events. The offshore system relied on a sprawling global industry of bankers, lawyers, accountants, and go-betweens who worked together to protect client secrets. So how did government fight offshore abuses? In this case, in February 2015, the German law enforcement agencies had launched a series of raids targeting Commerzbank in Germany and tax fraud investigations that led them to criminal charges against Mossack Fonseca's employees. In Brazil, the law firm became a target in a bribery and money laundering investigation involving top officials in that government. The British Virgin Islands authorities fined Mossack Fonseca $37,500 for violating anti-money laundering rules because the firm incorporated a company for the son of the former Egyptian president Hosni Mubarak, but failed to identify the connection. And in 2013, United Kingdom leader David Cameron urged his country's overseas territories, including the British Virgin Islands, to work with him to, quote, get our own houses in order and join the fight against tax evasion and offshore secrecy. But there are many ways to evade government investigations. Mossack Fonseca's home country, Panama, has refused to embrace a plan for worldwide exchange of information about bank accounts, out of concern that its offshore industry would be left at a competitive disadvantage. Many other countries offer alternative ways to hide money or evade taxes in the home countries of the people creating the accounts. In the US, for example, states like Delaware and Nevada, which have allowed company owners to remain anonymous, continue to fight against efforts to require greater corporate transparency. Companies can also launder money through high-priced US real estate, as in the news, much of it flowing through New York City real estate in many cases. The examples from the readings gave how global bribery ultimately has the most severe effect on developing nations. They gave the example of $275 million in bribes by the Italian energy giant Saipem, won the company $10 billion in contracts to build oil and gas pipelines. In this case, in February 2016, an Algerian court found that a Saipem subsidiary guilty of fraud, money laundering, and corruption in obtaining contracts from Algeria's national oil company, Sonatrach. And this is a chronic problem in global extractive industries. 37 companies within the Panama Papers have been oil extractive companies of some kind. From the firm's internal files, more than 1,400 companies had names referring to mining, minerals, oil, petrol, or gas. And the pattern in Africa and other developing regions, where countries with the richest national endowments often lose the most money offshore. The UN estimates $50 billion a year is missing in Africa due to illicit money flows. And how is this white-collar crime facilitated? UN notes such countries often have weak regulation and limited resources for fighting such crime. Military expenditures strip resources in many of these countries, even as private mercenaries dominate war-torn nations for their own profit. Corporations have so much power relative to the governments that they regularly operate sweatshops that violate even the minimal labor standards of these developing nations. So cracking down on their offshore tax evasion is not even in the cards. And unfortunately, global lending from institutions like the IMF and World Bank end up itself siphoned off to global corporations, leaving the countries without the economic development dollars, but officially still owing money to the World Bank and IMF. In the reading, Friedrichs argues the World Bank doesn't necessarily set out to do harm, but, quote, its mode of operation is intrinsically criminogenic and it functions undemocratically, creates too many opportunities for abuse. So what you have is this system of fraud driven by offshore banking at the highest level of private finance and often facilitated even by public financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, draining the developed world, the US and other countries, of tax revenue, but even more, stripping developing nations of key resources they desperately need to develop.